On behalf of my colleague, Dr. Bob Weber from Kansas State University and I'd like to welcome you to the module entitled Breeding System Design Principles. I'm Matt Spangler, and I'll be the presenter for this module. I'm a professor of animal genetics and extension beef genetics specialist at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. I hold a PhD in animal breeding and genetics from the University of Georgia, and I've had the opportunity to work with the genetic evaluation of over 20 different beef cattle breed organizations. As a general overview of this module, we'll discuss breeding objectives, breeding system decisions, define economically relevant traits, and also discuss breed selection. Let's now define a breeding objective. A breeding objective clearly identifies economically relevant traits, those traits that are directly associated with the cost of production or directly associated with the source of revenue. A breeding objective includes a detailed description of operational goals, including how replacements will be procured, if they're going to be raised or if they're going to be purchased. It also defines how and when animals will be sold. For example, will they be sold at weaning? Or perhaps, will they be retained through the feedlot phase and may be sold on a value grade-based system? It also identifies any management or environmental constraints. For example, is labor limited during calving time? That would be a management constraint. Or is forage availability limited in part because of limited moisture? That could be an environmental constraint. Clearly identifying breeding objectives enables producers to better define their breeding system by choosing the correct breeds and then placing emphasis on the correct traits when choosing bulls. Here's an example of a simplified breeding objective. It states that the ranch's objective is to produce cattle that conceive as yearlings and are able to calve unassisted and produce marketable weaned calves. They strive to breed low-input replacement females that have an average age of culling at 9 years, and they produce calves that are demanded by backgrounders and fed cattle owners. What this objective identifies is that they sell calves at weaning, so weaning weight is economically relevant to them. It also says that they keep back their own replacement females, and with an average culling age of 9 years, fertility and longevity are obviously important too. It does also note that input is low and they expect females to calve unassisted. So it says that things like calving ease, both direct and maternal, would be important, and perhaps things more conservative in mature weight and lactation potential could be important as well. Let's think about the decision process for designing a breeding program. First, you have to choose whether you're going to be purebred or seed stock, and note that seed stock could be a composite breeding program as well. Or if you're a commercial producer, then crossbreeding makes intuitive sense. So that determines the system at a high level. You also have to choose breeds that enter into that system, preferably based on objective breed strengths that match the stated breeding objectives, and if crossbreeding, to take advantage of breed complementarity, and of course keeping in mind regional adaptation. From there, individuals have to be selected, and they should be selected based on genetic merit using EPD and economic selection indexes that best match the breeding objectives. Furthermore, the choosing of bulls or semen should be thought of as an investment with an opportunity for a financial return. Here's a bit more detail about the decision process. It's important to identify resource and labor availability. These are often things that are too expensive to change, and as a consequence, the breeding program, the goals of the breeding program, and ultimately the individuals, the animals selected to enter it, have to meet these limitations. Choose whether or not you're going to create your own replacement females or purchase them. That determines how important female fertility traits are in your selection program. Determine what the market endpoint is. Are calves sold at weaning? Are they sold at a year of age? Or are they sold as slaughter animals directly? This helps define what the sale point is and thus what EPD might be economically relevant, be it weaning weight, yearling weight, or perhaps carcass weight. And then determine if those animals will be sold on some kind of value-based scheme whereby carcass metrics may become more important. Oftentimes, producers try to do it all. They retain their own replacement females, whilst try to excel in whatever market endpoint that they're selling their terminal calves. This becomes a very broad breeding objective that includes a lot of economically relevant traits that impact net profitability. There are advantages in separating breeding objectives to focus on only one, either maternal or terminal. Here are a few benefits of making that decision. For terminal producers, who would presumably then source replacement females from maternal producers, and those replacement females are bred to be lower input and bred for improved fertility, the terminal producer would benefit from heavier calves and less feed intake from smaller cows. There should be less calving difficulty if the terminal producer is able to source replacement females that are bred with their second or later calf, because they then don't have to calve heifers themselves. There would be an increase in uniformity because there would be commonality among breeding objectives, and there would be more focus because you're only trying to do one thing and do it very, very well. Recall the very simple profit equation here, where profit equals revenue minus costs. Generally speaking, revenue is easier to measure than costs are. But it's important to understand unit cost of production to truly understand profitability of the ranch enterprise, and as a consequence, understand where there's room for improvement and where the breeding system and genetic selection decisions can help aid in improving overall profit. For beef firms that retain their own replacement females, this depicts the relative economic weights of reproduction, growth, and carcass traits, where reproduction is twice as economically important as growth and 10 times more economically important than carcass. By no means does this say that carcass attributes or post-weaning gain can be ignored in selection decisions. What it does say, though, is reproductive traits are far more important than either. Let's now discuss economically relevant traits. An economically relevant trait is one that is directly associated with the cost of production or a source of revenue. All other traits are what we call indicator traits. Let's look at a couple of examples and compare birth weight to calving ease. We would say that calving ease is the economically relevant trait because calving difficulty has a cost associated with it, either through increased labor or, in the worst case, death of cow or calf. Birth weight is simply an indicator of calving ease, but itself is not tied to a source of revenue or a cost. What about weaning weight or yearling weight? Well, here it depends on the breeding objective and what the point of sale of terminal calves is. If calves are sold at weaning, then weaning weight is economically relevant. If, however, the market point is closer to a year of age, then yearling weight is economically relevant. Once a breeding system has been defined, it's actually time to decide which breeds should be involved. And they should be based on the breeding objective. Which breeds have complementary strengths that help advance the breeding objective? And for crossbreeding purposes, you should contemplate more than one breed to take advantage of heterosis and breed complementarity. This slide was adapted from a former colleague, Jim Gosey, at the University of Nebraska. And it helps define different levels of production given certain environmental constraints. An example, if feed availability is high and environmental stress is low, then biologically animals can be moderate to heavy milking and moderate to large in terms of mature size, because their ability to store energy needs only to be low to moderate. However, if feed availability is low and environmental stress is high, then choosing animals that have lower to moderate milk potential and lower to moderate mature size would be advantageous to ensure that they have enough nutrients to maintain themselves in a stressful, low feed input environment. Let's look at how breeds compare. This is from data from the U.S. Meat Animal Research Center in Clay Center, Nebraska, where females were contrasted for mature weight. The females, denoted by the red bars, were born in the early 1970s, whereby those represented by the blue bars were born in the late 1990s to early 2000s. Mature weight is on the vertical axis in pounds. On the horizontal axis is the breed of sire, where we have Hereford Angus or Angus Hereford cross females, Red Angus sired, Simmental sired, Gelbvieh sired, Limousin sired, and Charolais sired. There are two important take-home messages from this. One, in approximately 3 decades, all breeds increased in terms of mature size. During that same time period, however, there appeared to be a rank change, whereby some continental breeds were actually smaller, at least numerically at maturity, than were British breeds. This slide shows much more recent estimates of differences in mature cow weight across breeds. This is also work done with the U.S. Meat Animal Research Center. On the left, we have the breeds, and on the right, the corrected effective breed contrasted to Angus, and these deviations are in pounds. So an example, on average, Hereford cows weigh 38.5 pounds less at maturity compared to Angus cows. Understanding current differences between breeds is paramount to correctly forming a breeding system to ensure that the breeds selected actually help match the breeding objective. This table depicts breed differences for the traits of birth weight, weaning weight, yearling weight, milk, marbling, ribeye area, fat thickness, and carcass weight. These estimates come from the U.S. Meat Animal Research Center's Germplasm Evaluation Project. There are a couple of important things to note to aid in correctly interpreting the values in this table. One is that all Angus values are set to 0, meaning that all other breeds are contrasted to Angus. An example, if we compare Simmental and Angus for the trait of birth weight, we would say that on average, Simmental calves weigh 6.8 pounds more at birth than do Angus calves. You also note that some breeds are missing values for carcass traits. These estimates have been adjusted for sire sampling. In other words, they are adjusted for how the Angus bulls, in example, used at U.S. Mark, deviated from the Angus average in terms of genetic merit. The same adjustment is made for all other breeds. This requires the use of EPD. and some breeds do not publish Carcass EPD, and in some cases instead publish EPD on an ultrasonic carcass basis. Regardless, without EPD and the same scale and interpretation, these adjustments for sire sampling cannot be made. These effects are updated annually, and the annual updates are available at the Beef Improvement Federation website. I have a link on the bottom of this slide for the most recent values. I would also point out that the annual updates include breed of sire differences, which are half of a breed difference. And recall that in the table on the current slide, I show breed differences. While the rank of breeds would be the same, whether showing a breed difference or a breed of sire difference, the magnitude would be different. And it's important to understand the difference between the two so as not to misinterpret the differences between breeds. To summarize, it's important to clearly identify breeding objectives. These should detail how and when cattle are to be sold, if females are to be retained, and if there are any environmental or labor constraints. These are also long-lasting to provide continued direction. They are not things that should change from year to year. It's important to clearly identify economically relevant traits, because these help define which breeds to utilize and also help define what EPDs or economic selection indices to place selection pressure on. It's important to compare and choose breeds based on the most current available breed differences to ensure that the decisions are accurate, because breeds do change over time. For continued learning, I'd encourage you to complete the next module in this series, Module 11, Heterosis and Crossbreeding Systems. For concepts related to breeding system design principles, in addition to the next module, I'd also encourage you to watch Modules 2 and 4, both of which discuss economically relevant traits. And for more information regarding the USLGE, I would encourage you to visit their website listed here. Again, thank you for watching this module.